I want to thank the organizers of the conference for giving me this opportunity to speak to you and give my perspectives as an American Jew on this general topic. I'm really grateful for that opportunity. In conceiving this conference, the organizers knew in theory they were going to be addressing an important issue in American life. But events since we first began organizing it have proven just how fortuitous our choice was of the topic. American Islamophobes like Representative Peter King and Pamela Geller and David Yerushalmi, who I'll be talking about a little bit later on, have turned up the heat and the volume on this debate and placed into even starker relief the necessity of having a rational, tolerant discussion of the role of Islam and American Muslims in the life of this nation. Here's what we can't do. We can't score political points. We can't try to win elections. We can't single out our fellow citizens as terrorists merely because of their religious beliefs. We can't demonize all American Muslims for the beliefs of a handful of extremists among them. Anyone who does this must be held up for the bigot he or she is. In the light of the American assassination of Osama bin Laden, this becomes an even more urgent task. No matter how many times a president says he isn't seeking to tar an entire religion with a broad brush merely because of the acts of one adherent or one terrorist group, it doesn't mean the rest of us have gotten the message. In fact, yesterday, a pilot on a Delta Airlines flight out of Memphis refused to take off because there were two passengers who were dressed, who were imams and dressed as imams dress. They wouldn't fly, the pilot wouldn't fly until they were removed from the plane. They were taken off the plane. Apparently their dress so spooked him that he must have believed that he had Osama's cousins flying with him. That kind of action cannot stand, and I understand that our executive committee that planned this event is going to be organizing a letter to Senator Maria Cantwell about this issue. Whatever we may have thought of the bin Laden killing, Barack Obama now has an opportunity to head off the bigots in the Republican Party and the Tea Party movement who will try to make hay from this. Clearly, it's going to be tough for the Republicans in the coming election. A major issue of national security has practically been foreclosed to them. When a party becomes desperate, it seeks the weakest link to attack. Unfortunately, some in this country see American Muslims as this weak link. They will tar and feather them. Remember the smears against Obama during the presidential election, which still cause a majority of Republicans to believe that he's a Muslim. Look to the political right to exploit fear of Islam and make hay in the 2012 election. It may be used in the presidential election. It may be used in the federal or state elections. We must be alert to fight against such bigotry. That's why it's important for non-Muslims, specifically Jews, because of our complicated, fraught relationship, to step up and say we won't stand for it. I wanted to speak about a few specific events that have occurred here in Seattle and in other places that might instruct us about the problems we face as Jews and Muslims in overcoming our suspicions and conflict. In 2006, a mentally ill Pakistani American named Naveed Haq forced his way into the Seattle Jewish Federation office and proceeded to shoot at the staff, killing one woman and seriously injuring 4 others. In his twisted mind, he equated the Jews of Seattle with the acts of Israel committed during the Lebanon War that took place in the same year. This was an act of hatred and violence unprecedented in Seattle's Jewish community. It shook many people to the core. Thankfully, the strident ideologues in the community representing groups like Stand With Us, who I understand might have been protesting outside, although I didn't see them yesterday night, they didn't set the tone for the response. But the best that can be said is that the community's response wasn't worse than it otherwise might have been. The first jury to hear the case couldn't agree on a sentence and there was a mistrial. The prosecution announced it was retrying him. It insisted on trying him for first-degree murder despite his documented history of mental illness, going back 10 years. The district attorney attempted to argue that this deranged individual knew right from wrong and rationally planned his acts of violence. All this despite the fact that he was a deeply confused, disoriented, alienated, and sick man. One of the Federation victims who was shot said to the press that the most important aspect of the case was not religious hatred or anti-Semitism, but rather the fact that it was so incredibly easy for such a disturbed person to get a gun. The prosecution refused to consider a sentence to a mental asylum. All this in large part because the Jewish community leadership would not settle for anything less than prison and punishment. Sadly, the Jews of Seattle lacked the capacity to understand that despite the fact that Haq, in his delusional state, blamed American Jews for Lebanon's suffering, he was a sick man and not an Islamic radical. For Seattle Jews, this was a hate crime, not a crime committed by someone who was mentally ill. And this, I think, is a tragedy that is beyond the actual tragedy of the shootings. American Jews had a chance to understand the difference between anti-Semitism and mental illness, and they chose to see themselves as victims of Muslim extremism rather than as a victim of a man who himself was a victim of his own demons. Naveed Haq was not Osama bin Laden. If anything, he was Arthur Bremer, the man who attempted to assassinate George Wallace. Men whose delusions and twisted imaginations combined all sorts of hatred and set them on their homicidal rampage. Naveed Haq needed treatment, not punishment. Besides, life in a mental asylum for violent felons would not have been a vacation. When Brenda Bentz and I were considering which speakers to invite, she had no lack of Muslims with deep expertise on the subjects we were going to discuss. But we wanted non-Muslim experts on racial hatred to speak as well. So we invited Mark Potok, the chief researcher of the Southern Poverty Law Center, to address us. Both Brenda and I were impressed that SPLC had recently added to its national list of hate groups several Islamophobic organizations like Pam Geller's Stop the Islamization of America and the Jewish Task Force, a successor to the Jewish Defense League. And Potok wanted to come and join us. It seemed that the SPLC might be ready to branch out from its bread and butter reliance on white supremacist groups to include far-right anti-Muslim scapegoat groups as well. However, we were disappointed when Potok and SPLC's president informed us that because CARE was a co-sponsor of this conference, they couldn't join us. Though I don't know a lot about SPLC's internal politics, you can be sure that there were many major donors, some of them liberal Jews, on their donor list. The group's president, Richard Cohen, and Potok certainly want to protect their funding sources and their salary, and they don't want to rock the boat in any substantial way. Even liberal Jews get spooked by spurious charges that CARE supports Hamas or Islamic terror. It probably won't even help much that CARE actually denounced Osama bin Laden and said that his death was something that they could approve of. Some people are just too frightened to give up their fears. Apparently, the campaign of demonization by the likes of Peter King and Frank Gaffney prevented even a group like SPLC from associating itself in even the most distant way with a mainstream Muslim entity like CARE. This is what hate, fear, and ignorance do to us, folks. It twists our judgment, prevents us from trusting our instincts, turns us away from alliances we should be making with like-minded individuals and groups to advance our respective goals. I don't know whether my primary emotion is anger or disappointment regarding SPLC. Mostly, I just feel sorry for their caution and ultimately their cowardice. Groups like this who refuse to address the most divisive issues of the day out of fear either are or will shortly be irrelevant. If we want to make a difference as a religious community or as NGOs, we have to take a stand even if we risk alienating those who sit on the fence. Now I want to talk to you about something that was a more personal, deep disappointment for me. There's a national group called the Foundation for Ethnic Understanding, founded by a New York rabbi, Mark Schneer. It organizes a mosque-synagogue twinning project each year devoted to education around the issues of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. A few years ago, I spent some months with my friend Jeff Siddiqui searching for two partners here in Seattle. And we had a hard time of it, frankly. This was just after the Hawk shooting, and memories may have been tender on both sides. At my synagogue congregation, Beth Shalom, our rabbi enthusiastically agreed to participate. She delegated me to search for a local Muslim partner. With Jeff's help, I identified MAPS as our Muslim partner. I had a wonderful meeting with several mosque members, one of whom, Shams, is here over there. And we mapped out what I thought would be a warm, stimulating series of programs for our community. We'd go to MAPS, they would come to us. We'd pray there, they would pray with us, much like Imam Raouf did last night, so movingly, here in the church. Our rabbi would address them, and their imam would address us, but it wasn't to be. I reported back to the rabbi, and in the meantime, members of Stand With Us in the congregation had pressured her into backing off from the commitment. She apologetically told me now wasn't the right time. She didn't know how she could possibly have agreed to an imam speaking in the synagogue from our bima. It just couldn't be done. She needed at most another month to bring the shul's membership and leadership around. She promised the idea for the program would not die, and she was committed to making it happen. But it never did. And my relationship with the rabbi has never been the same and may never be. The issue of Muslim-Jewish relations is too important to allow our leaders to fumble their commitments. There are other communal leaders who try to mollify both sides. 2 years ago, the rabbi at Temple Teher Sinai sponsored a highly partisan Jewish Federation program at which a representative of AIPAC and the Israeli Consul General spoke about the dangers posed by Iran to the Middle East and the world. They claimed Iran was seeking to develop nuclear weapons and that it supported terrorism, among other things. The fact that Israel had nuclear weapons and engaged in wars against its neighbors wasn't considered relevant. After the program, I asked the rabbi how he could allow his temple to be a venue for such partisanship. Unfortunately, it escalated into a heated discussion during which he affirmed that he was in favor of violent regime change in Iran. Now, this same rabbi has invited Professor John Esposito, one of Professor Haddad's colleagues, to speak in a few days at his synagogue about the role of Islam in America. There's a major disconnect among some Jews regarding relations with Muslims and Islam. Like Rabbi Wiener, they seem to think they can compartmentalize Islam into the good guys and the bad guys, that they can demonize bad Muslims in Iran while embracing good ones here at home. I'm not arguing that the Iranian regime is worthy of anyone's support, but I'm arguing that rhetoric that accuses the Iranian regime of being mass murderers and supports its violent overthrow while ignoring the negative role that Israel plays is not conducive to constructive dialogue with any Muslim, whether Iranian or American. After 9/11, the Republican Party discovered there was gold in them there hills of Islamophobia and Muslim bashing. It was joined in this by a group I call the Jewish neocons, whose hatred of Islam is bound up with a devotion to a far-right brand of Israeli nationalism which embraces the settler movement. That is how Peter King and Frank Gaffney's Center for Security Policy created a match made in heaven. With the new Republican majority in the House, King became the chair of the Committee on Homeland Security. Looking for a new issue to call his own, and hailing from a state with a substantial Jewish population, he made common cause with Gaffney over the alleged issue of Sharia law and the alleged plot by Muslims to take over the US government and replace it with one governed by Sharia. King's hearings were originally conceived very much in the mold of Gaffney's histrionics, which warn of the Muslim menace to American life as we know it. But due to critical media coverage and criticism from fellow members of Congress, King presented a still offensive but watered-down version in his hearings last month. Gaffney is joined in his anti-Sharia jihad by Jewish far-right figures like David Yerushalmi. The latter, who is a devout Orthodox Jewish attorney and supporter of the settler movement, is Gaffney's chief legal counsel. Mother Jones profiled the Yerushalmi-Gaffney national campaign to write anti-Sharia sentiment into state laws. Such provisions have either passed or are being seriously discussed in 11 states. Yerushalmi is the author of such bills and no doubt a handsomely remunerated consultant for his expertise and much sought after, I would guess, on the Tea Party circuit. I'm pleased to tell you, though, that the organized Jewish community is beginning to wake up to the perils of the anti-Sharia movement, because it could hit Jews where they live. Just as Muslims conform their religious lives to Sharia, so observant Jews conform theirs to halakha. Just as Sharia may be applied to normally civil functions like divorce and marriage and estate planning, so too Jews often use halakha in place of civil code in these important life milestones. If state law criminalizes the application of Sharia to civil matters, then there's no reason why this wouldn't happen to Jews as well. And I'm pleased to tell you that last month in St. Louis, the ACLU and the Jewish Community Relations Council joined together to denounce publicly the effort to ban Sharia under Missouri law. But now I want to tell you something that may sound a little cynical. In truth, I don't think that most observant Jews would normally care to make common cause with American Muslims on this issue. But that's the beauty of the American system. You have to create political coalitions if you wish for your own communal, religious, or ethnic interests to be addressed. In our system, if you try to go it alone, you won't go far. That encourages groups to look beyond their narrow interests and consider the interests of other groups when they overlap yours. It's this making of alliances as opposed to confining oneself to a separatist ghetto that makes this country great. The Yerushalmis and Gaffneys favor an atomized America in which every individual or group is out for its own good, and some mythical Judeo-Christian majority can impose its own will on the rest of us. That's not my America, and I know it's not yours either. Yerushalmi's views are so far to the right that Mother Jones, the Jewish Forward, and in my blog, I have called him different variations of the phrase Jewish white supremacist. It's hard to believe there can be such a person, given the history, given Jewish history in the last century, but I'm sorry to say that there can and there is. Yerushalmi didn't take kindly to my critique of his political views, and he's threatened to sue me for libel in Arizona, where he resides, making himself right at home with the anti-immigrant movement that presides there. I, of course, had to scurry to find a pro bono counsel to represent me in what I feared would be a long and costly case. But in a bit of providence, the Anti-Defamation League came to my rescue. They came out with a public statement denouncing him and likening his views to the white supremacist New World Order. I'm guessing that the anti-Muslim attorney decided that now might not be the best time to sue someone for calling him a white supremacist, and he withdrew his threat. Yerushalmi also crusaded against the Khalil Gibran Academy in New York City and its Muslim principal, Debbie Almonteser, eventually getting her fired. He sued her for libel too, and she won at both the lower court and the appeals court level. She also won a substantial settlement from the city of New York for wrongful termination. Now I want to talk a little bit about the Ground Zero, the quote-unquote Ground Zero Mosque. Yerushalmi also made common cause with the Jewish right-wing blogger Pam Geller, author of Atlas Shrugged, and the chief instigator of the campaign against what she branded as the Ground Zero Mosque, an institution which our keynote speaker, Imam Faisal Rauf, was intimately involved with for some time. I watched this Jewish-led campaign against the mosque, conveniently timed to the 2010 congressional election campaign, with horror. The arguments against it made no sense. They were clearly fueled by fear and ignorance. They mixed up the tragedy perpetrated by Al-Qaeda against this country on 9/11 with an entirely separate matter of building a Muslim house of worship. In the minds of the hysterics, there was no difference between the two. This is a profoundly un-American attitude. One of the hallmarks of America's greatness is our tolerance towards religions. Our founding fathers wisely chose not to create a state religion in this country. And in turn, this enabled America to become a powerful engine of democracy, which could incorporate hundreds of ethnic groups and their respective religions into a single whole. In diversity, there is strength. Alternatively, you remember the slogan on our currency, e pluribus unum, out of many, one. But contrary to Yerushalmi and Geller, I don't believe we become one by denying our difference, by papering them over, or by forcing those who are different to conform to some artificial notion of what is properly American. We gain strength to be united by coming together over our shared interests and respecting our differences. That's the beauty of America. The opponents of the Park 51 mosque lost sight of an American trademark, religious freedom. In this country, you can worship your God and your religion as you please. You can build a house of worship where you want and how you want, as long as you obey the zoning codes. America doesn't police religion as other countries do. We don't tell people where they can build their church, mosque, or synagogue. We don't interfere in their religious teachings. We don't demonize them because their religion is different than ours. The movement led by Pam Geller, David Yerushalmi, and Frank Gaffney, which seeks to criminalize being a Muslim, is profoundly offensive to American values. I'm proud to say this as an American and as a Jew. Thank you.